thanks for being here. In this talk, I'm going to present the first few results from my PhD project. So variation is the raw material for evolution. Without variation in a species would not be able to change at all. But it's not always clear just how exactly variation determines how a species evolves. So on very short timescales, from one generation to the next, we know that evolution is constrained by covariation between traits. So selection of one trait can inhibit or enhance selection on others. So the next generation will evolve along the direction of this trait constraint. And also, at macroevolutionary timescales, so from one species to the next, we know that new species tend to evolve in the direction of maximum variation of their ancestors. But we don't know much about the time step in between. So evolution of a single species, these processes tend to happen over timescales of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. And to study them, we need an incredibly detailed fossil record that extends back to millions of years. Okay, so to study microevolutionary processes, I study a specific group of plankton called Foraminifera. The single-celled organisms, about the size of a grain of sand, and they build little shells of calcium carbonate. There are many different species. They come in all sorts of sizes and shapes, and are very globally distributed throughout the world's oceans, and they're very abundant. And when they die, shells sink to the ocean floor, they're preserved in the sediment in huge numbers. Just to give you an idea, a teaspoonful of ocean sediment can contain up to 1,000 fossils of Foraminifera. So if you dig through ocean sediment, you can create an incredibly high-resolution fossil record that extends back to millions of years ago. So that's very useful for studies of microevolutionary processes. So the aim of my study was to look at how variation within a species determines the microevolutionary trajectories. To do this, I studied the fossil record of two species of Foraminifera. So the first is Brombacher articulata, that became extinct about 2.4 million years ago. The second is Brombacher cruciformis. This one survives to the present day. And they lived in more or less the same depth habitats, the same geographical range. And they also look pretty similar, so they've got this one flat side, more inflated chambers on the other side, and the chambers coil around the center axis. So these two, I studied morphology of these two species over an interval of about 500,000 years before Brombacher became extinct. So the material I used was from one specific site in the North Atlantic. It was drilled by the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program. And it's situated in a specific system of ocean currents called North Atlantic Subtropical Gyre. So this is a system of circulating ocean currents. And it's a very oceanographically stable region because there are no major currents cutting in through the north to south. That means that there won't be much migration of plankton. So any changes in the morphology we'll see will most likely reflect the variations in this particular population. And also the material at this site is very well preserved, so any changes in morphology are most likely due to real biological processes and not to dissolution of fossils. So to capture as much variation in the species as possible, I measured about 100 individuals per sample per species over an interval of 500,000 years with a time resolution of about 5 to 8,000 years. So this resulted in a total of 13,000 individuals. And I picked them out of the sediment, mounted them with glass slides, and measured them automatically for size and for shape. For size we use area, and for shape we use aspect ratio. So aspect ratio is the measure between length and width of an object. So a square has an aspect ratio of 1, and a rectangle has an aspect ratio higher than 1. Right, so first, starting with measurements of morphology over time, we've got size and shape for Brombacher cruciformis. So starting with Brombacher, the species that became extinct. See that first it started out quite large, but then suddenly around 2.7 million years ago it shifted to much smaller shells. And it remained small until eventually it became extinct about 200,000 years later. So this is the last sample where I can find the species. And comparing that to the survivor species, the cruciformis, so that there's not much change in size in this species. There's some variation, but it's all sort of centered around a very stable mean. And looking at shape, again, we see that initially Brombacher, so the species became extinct, started out with pretty low aspect ratio values. I mean, it was pretty square, pretty rounded. And then between 2.6 and 2.7 million years ago, the aspect ratio values increased, so it became more rectangular. And interestingly, it's occurred at about the same time that size decreased. Again, comparing that to the survivor species, we see that there's again not much variation in this species. So now we can see if there's any covariation between traits in either species. Starting with Crassiformis, the survivor species, we see some pretty random cloud data points. There's not much directional variation going on in this species. But looking at Reticulata, first they start out as pretty big, pretty square. Then there was a certain shift to smaller values, that's this group. And then finally this shifted to much more rectangular values. So over the course of about 500,000 years, the species, Reticulata changed from large square shapes to much smaller and much more rectangular shells. So now we'd like to know if either of these patterns was determined by the variation in the species. To do that, we used principal component analysis over every sample individually. So the primary axis of the principal component analysis shows where the direction of maximum variation in your sample is. And then where the secondary axis cuts through, that's the mean of the sample. So if variation determines the evolution of the species, we'd expect that the subsequent sample will more or less move along the direction of maximum variation of the previous sample. So in this case, so this is the second sample plotted over there first, and we see that the mean nicely moves along the direction of maximum variation. Also, if variation determines evolution, we'd expect that the direction of maximum variation of two subsequent samples, the angle between those two is very small, because otherwise you get sort of just random variation in the species. So looking at the principal component axes for Reticulata first. So first it starts out as this nice, large, round shells. And we see that the means indeed sort of move along the direction of maximum variation of the sample, samples in this interval. So then the next step is it decreased in size. So if it follows the direction of maximum variation, we'd expect the thing to end up about here. And we see that that is indeed more or less the case. But then it shifted to more rectangular values. So again, we'd expect it to move in this direction. But when we plot those axes, we see that they're much more removed in this direction. So comparing that to the survivor species, that was just more, there wasn't any directional variation going on here. And indeed, we see that that's the case also for the principal component axes. To see if there's any statistical significance in these patterns, looked at the angles between the direction of maximum variation of subsequent samples. So if evolution is completely independent of variation, then we'd expect that the angles between two samples would be completely randomly distributed. But if not, if variation does drive evolution, we'd expect the angles to be all relatively small. Starting with Reticulata. So this red line indicates the number of angles you'd expect if they were completely randomly distributed. But we see there's actually a significant number of angles that's between 0 and 1/4 pi radians. So that's between 0 and 45 degrees. So that means that they are quite small, and that means evolution of the species seems to be driven by the variation in the species. But surprisingly, the same also goes for Crassiformis. So even though the species doesn't show any directional change at all, the position in morphospace of population seems to be largely determined by position of the ancestor populations. So in most species it seems that variation drives the microevolutionary patterns. But it doesn't explain why Reticulata suddenly shifts from to much smaller and more rectangular shells. So going back to the variation in the traits over time, by 2.7 million years ago, there was the shift to much smaller and more rectangular shells that wasn't predicted by the variation in the species. At this time interval in itself is very interesting, because about 2.7 million years ago, exactly that time, ice sheets in the northern hemisphere started to expand. So sea surface temperature decreased, productivity regimes all over the world changed, and it could be that this species just wasn't very well adapted to these changes. Also because about 200,000 years later, it eventually became extinct. So, in summary, it seems that for both species, microevolutionary trajectories seem to be determined by the variation in the species, but external factors such as environmental change can influence these trajectories and might eventually even lead to the extinction